Did you know women make up 65% of realtors, but we are woefully underrepresented in firm leadership and management? Also, did you know, according to the 2020 US Census, people of color, in other words, the collective of Black, Indigenous, Asian, Hispanic, or Latino, Latinx, Latine, depending on your preference, people of color make up a whopping 38% of the US population, but we are only a measly 13%. So we're less than one third of what we should be of realtors. You may be wondering, okay, what's the problem with that? People can pick different career fields. People may not want to be in management. Well, historically, underrepresentation among real estate professionals like agents, mortgage brokers, and lenders, appraisers, has meant an unfair housing fiasco. And unfortunately, when unfair housing happens, it often goes unchecked, again, without a greater level of representation and diversity. Today is no different, friends. Case in point, remember the expose by Newsday entitled Long Island Divided that showed steering does still indeed happen? Exactly. You do remember, I'm sure. Since 2020, a laundry list of companies have been hit with fines for redlining in this century. Yes, it's technically been illegal since the 1960s, over 50 years. But in this century, within the last few years, did you know that these companies have been hit with fines for some form of modern day redlining? Redfin, Facebook, KeyBank, Trustmark National Bank, City National Bank, Park National Bank, Lakeland Bank, Trident Mortgage, Cadence Bank, and there are so many others. Collectively, they have paid multiple millions. Yet we know fines alone are not the solution. Such data easily points to the need for a concerted effort from all of us to proactively recruit, hire, and develop everyone, especially our underrepresented communities, in order to ensure fair housing is achieved. But will the partial elimination of affirmative action in elite college admissions eventually impact the representation, access, and opportunity of those in the real estate industry? Is it a non-factor for home ownership, or is it the tipping point stoking the flames higher of unfair housing? To answer these questions and so much more, I am honored to be joined by a bright mind in education, my own professor from Spelman College, Dr. Jackson. Let's get into it.
It was prompted certainly by the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King, but it was also prompted by the Cold War. As you recall, this was a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were competing against one another. And the Soviet Union used the US's treatment of African Americans for propaganda. And it became rather effective because the whole world knew how African Americans were being treated. But in 1961, so John F. Kennedy issued the first executive order to say that the government would not discriminate against a person because of race. And those companies that work with the government could not use race, creed, color, or national origin to discriminate against others. And he had a Black attorney who worked with him in crafting this executive order. And the attorney put in the margins of the order the term affirmative action. And so that's where that whole notion of affirmative action came into being. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson added to Kennedy's order, and he said that not only would it include companies that were contracted with the government, but it would also include subcontractors. In 67, Johnson added sex to the list of attributes, but I think the one thing that distinguishes Johnson from Kennedy is that Johnson actually added teeth to his order. He said that that the companies would have to require a dissemination and enforcement of a non-discriminatory policy, that there would be the establishment of a written affirmative action plan, there would be an assignment of an official to oversee the plan, and that there would be specific action goals that this plan had to address and had to accomplish. So affirmative action, as we know it, really began in the business community. It was really not until the late 60s and early 70s that this idea of affirmative action was adopted by institutions of higher education. Well, I think it means my initial reaction and the reaction that I continue to have is that I think it means that we're in for a bumpy ride for a period of time. I think you will find that the number of people from underrepresented populations will decline in our more elite institutions, thus drying up the pipeline for underrepresented populations to go into various professions. And just to give you a highlight of what has happened, since the Supreme Court's decision, you find that within a week, 4 top diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging Hollywood executives were either dismissed or resigned from their positions. Florida's governor signed a bill into law stating that banning the state's public colleges and universities from allocating money for DEIB programs. Texas Governor Abbott followed DeSantis's lead, and his bill also bans mandatory diversity training for students and employees. There are 22 states that have introduced anti-DEIB legislation. So this is within 1 week, well, a week and 2 weeks, all right. I think one of the things to keep in mind, though, is that while these companies are not in legal jeopardy, they will not have to scramble and make all kinds of changes because the ruling was specifically related to college admissions. In short, the Supreme Court's ruling will have an adverse impact on racial diversity of the hiring pipeline for years to come. And legal experts say that the ruling could force companies to scale back corporate DEBI efforts. But companies have to realize that by the year 2040, demographers have suggested that this country will be minority majority, meaning that the majority of people in this country will be people of color. And in order to remain competitive, effective, and profitable, they will have to address the issues of diversity. I think it's important that the real estate industry is in the forefront because the wealth, for the majority of Americans, our wealth is tied to our equity in our homes. So the real estate industry has to be, I think, in the forefront of ensuring and paying attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it was really the housing industry that for a large part helped in terms of this systemic problems and lack of wealth that Black Americans have. What happened was in 2020, with the death of George Floyd, many companies began to throw lots of money to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sometimes without a lot of thought or organization behind it. And when they were not able to see the quick results that they expected, some companies and people in these companies have become somewhat disillusioned. But this is a long game. It's not something that can be cured overnight. It is something that this country has grappled with since its inception. The research is supportive of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs. It says that inclusive companies are more likely to hit financial targets by up to 120%, and this is according to Forbes. And it says that companies can also reach a more diverse audience with a more diverse workforce, and studies show that diverse organizations innovate at a faster rate. First of all, I do think that managers should educate themselves. And one of the things that they can read right off the bat would be Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissenting opinion to the affirmative action case. I mean, I don't normally read dissenting opinions or opinions written by Supreme Court justices, but hers was succinct, it was brilliant, and it gave a historical perspective as to why affirmative action is needed. And to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of things that are happening in education, P-12 as well as in higher ed, is either whitewashing, erasing, or minimizing the African-American contributions. And so you've got a whole mindset. I mean, I taught African diaspora in the world to entering first-year students at Spelman. These were all Black women. And the one thing that they all agreed on was the fact that they were unaware of half of the information we covered. And these are students who went to segregated schools, integrated schools, and some were predominantly PWI schools. And so it was unanimous across the board that there was a lack of education about the African Americans. And don't limit themselves to reading a few articles, but to take courses such as the one that I teach at Spelman. The online course would be a good one. I also think that they need to look at their diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging and see if they really have set goals. What do you do to ensure that you have a diverse workforce? What are you doing to ensure that your real estate agents are able to improve? What kind of professional development is being offered? Track it, not just say, oh, I'm friendly with so-and-so, but to really track it and make sure that you have folks at different levels who are representative of the diversity in this country. I have no doubt that history is on the side of those who believe that diversity is America's greatest strength.